Hi, everybody. It is such a treat and such a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to PAMM, to be in conversation with Julie Mehretu, myself, Franklin Sirmans, the director of the museum. And this is our second Scholl lecture of the season, and I want to thank Deborah and Dennis Scholl, who I think are here this evening. I also want to thank Emily Jane Kerwan from Marion Goodman Gallery, and Sarah Rentz from Julie's Studio. And I want to thank Anita Bram here at PAMM, and Adrian Chadwick, our head of education. It is really a pleasure to be here. We have, of course, this great occasion, and it is triggered by a couple of things. I mean, not only our love of Julie and her work, but of course, we also have a work of hers up right now downstairs. And that piece, Myriads, Only by Dark, is here because of someone else I want to thank, and that's Bob and Dee Dee Moss, who made that happen, that acquisition just last year. Thank you. And I want to thank Tobias Ostrander, our chief curator, for working with that piece and putting it into a conversation with another collection artist, Guillermo Cuica in particular, and for the many things that open up in that conversation, which also includes a large painting by Al Held. And I know Julie and I were just standing in there and thinking about some of those connections, but I'm going to try and save that. I'm going to give you a little bit of the straight-ahead bio. Julie Mehretu is a world-renowned painter born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1970. She currently lives and works in New York City and Berlin. She has a BA from Kalamazoo College, which included a year abroad at Sheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal. She received her Master's of Fine Art with honors from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1997. Mehretu is a recipient of many awards, including the MacArthur Award, 2005, the Berlin Prize at the American Academy in Berlin, 2007, and the U.S. Department of State Medal of Arts Award, 2015. Obviously, she has shown extensively around the world. Her most recent shows include Hudnik's Voodoo and Stele at Marion Goodman Gallery in New York, and Julie Mehretu, The Addis Show at Gebre Christos Desta Museum, Addis Ababa, 2016. She has an exhibition opening at the Serralves in Porto, Portugal, in May, and traveling to the Fundación Botín in Santander, Spain, in October. A retrospective survey is being organized and set to open at LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, in 2019 with our dear friend Christine Kim. Julie is also currently working on a massive two-part painting for the entrance of SF MoMA. I could go on. There are many accolades, but I've been waiting to have this conversation for the last almost 16 years. So let's do this. Okay, we're on? You're on?
We're on.
And I'm really not exaggerating. It was 16 years ago that I met you in the studio, and we met before that, but we had a little studio interview, and it was in preparation for a piece in the New York Times. And this was 2001, right?
Right after my show at the Project.
Project show had happened. So already there's like a host of different things that we could go off of just there.
Actually, it was before the Project show at the studio. That's right, Studio Museum.
That's right.
Freestyle time.
Because yes, that's right. Freestyle, big show. But I was telling Julie, I was like, let's try and talk a little bit chronologically, since I mean there are a lot of different entry points, and we touch upon a bunch of things, and I think that's a good place to start. Let's begin first by thinking about the language or the lexicon of what it is you do. And I think that goes back to that moment, right?
Absolutely. I'm just making sure that this is working because I don't think it was. Okay. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here and to have this conversation with you, and especially at this moment, so I'm super grateful. 2000, from between 1996, I would say, and 2000, I was like in this place of trying to invent and make sense of who I was or wanting to be as an artist, and thinking about the mark and trying to reduce my painting to its basic elements or what I was most interested in, knowing that I wanted to or insisted somehow inside of myself on abstraction. And so the mark, like I went down to just ink, small pens. First it was big brushes, and I would make a gesture on a piece of paper and do another and another, and they each had, when you looked at them all together, they were just individual marks, but I knew for me, inside of me, they each had a certain type of meaning somehow, but they didn't necessarily carry that by themselves. So I reduced them into this like miniature scale and started, and this was intuitively, not like a plan, and I started to work on them in a small way, but I would repeat them one after another, and then all of a sudden, in a group, they took on a different type of meaning. So that was maybe the first. And then I feel like when this early work was really about that initial investigation, the mark as a social agent, like as a glyph or as a character in that sense.
Yeah, we just came from talking about Clifford Still, and we were talking about sort of histories around abstract expressionism vis-a-vis that conversation. How did you go in that direction? I mean, how did you go see, I think, the possibilities of what abstraction represented, and even assigning, you've assigned these marks as sort of almost a figurative quality in some ways?
I think like when young artists and when you're learning to make, it's like, I think maybe similar to other forms, but you're really just mimicking and imitating and copying and trying to do what you think is something that will show like your capability, or if you can do it well. And so you copy from, like, whether it's like copying from paintings and then you're mimicking and so when I entered graduate school, we're making big, enormous abstract paintings that I thought were good paintings, and they weren't. I mean, they were just mark making, and they had no direction. And I was making in a moment of conceptual thinking, and there was coming out of the 90s or late 80s, and what was happening in terms of identity politics and the shift in that, and then also trying to negotiate who I was, and why did I want to maintain or insist this language? Why this form? Why painting? And especially why abstraction? Why not? Because in college I was working with figurative painting. I could have moved into, and it chose me, really. It was this thing that intuitively I was insistent on, and the question was like, for me, why? What is that? And what am I trying to unpack about myself in that language? And that's where I think that came from.
Yeah, you mentioned that time period, and it's interesting within the context of this museum. You know, we only became a collecting institution in '94. The influence of that time period that you're talking about is something that is heavily felt throughout the collection, just in terms of questions around identity, questions around globalism. And, you know, I remember in thinking about the work very early on, this idea of map making, and I mean, you said as much in trying to figure out, you know, what is my contribution. I think that conversation, I can't help but think, you know, with you being at RISD, I think of course, Shazia Sikander was somebody who was there not much
Just
before,
me, yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
Carol Walker.
Yeah.
So the prevalence of perhaps a certain discussion around contemporary art, and how did you know, having a voice within that, I think a very distinct voice within that is something that was there from the very beginning. But of course you went through something before to get to that point.
Yeah, it was like this desire to try and understand what was my intention here. And I think in making, things happen really you go backwards. At least for me, my understanding of what I'm doing happens after I've done it. And I have said this many times, but a good friend of mine says, my effort is to speak before I think in his making. It's like if my head gets in the way, it messes it all up. I'm not making or doing something interesting. But in the effort of I'm not working in the dark. Intuition is based on this knowledge and an understanding. But then that ended up kind of participating in the work. So I would make the drawings and then I would try and analyze them and take kind of certain types of rules to make sense of what I've done, to try and make sense of who I was. And in that process, I started then to collapse those processes into each other and layer them into each other in the paintings, so that you saw there was a copying of the absurd analysis of the paintings in the paintings, as well as the mark making and the actions, and then the infrastructure, and then so they all started to kind of layer in the work itself.
And does it begin with the drawing? I mean, you said, notice a couple of the images we looked at early on were very much, stripping down color and about trying to put the emphasis, I think, on drawing.
On the mark, and the mark as an agent, and the mark as being able to be by itself meaningless, maybe, or not be able to be as potent as it could be, or it was potent. Actually, the mark itself has this potency, but in it's defined by the kind of dynamic that it's engaged in with those marks that it's interacting with, or then pushing against somehow. But it's in the potency or belief in the kind of determinancy of the mark, or the insistence on that, which then goes back to the insistence of the individual, which is in what so much of painting tried to undermine, right? That the individual, or so much of contemporary, not necessarily contemporary, but so much of modernism and so much of the effort of modernism was about moving away from the individual and the individual, and that while there's huge importance in that, there was also a big denial of many and what many can be in that conversation. So there's this play of the two that was kind of floating between, or kind of sliding between those two places, in a slippery way.
And what gave you the wherewithal to feel like, okay, I can approach it from that point of view? I mean, I remember one of the things that, in writing about the work, there was, if I'm not mistaken, the title of the piece, which I didn't name initially, was something about mapping anew and urgent, something. And it was almost as if trying to correlate one's, biography alongside of the work. How do you find that balance? You've talked a little bit about the difference between when you end and the painting begins, this sort of space in between.
I think it's in the end, the painting has to keep evolving, and what happens in the painting, he has to keep pushing, surprising me and pushing, and otherwise it just becomes you have to kind of work through wherever you are so that you arrive somewhere else in the painting. And the more that I could put into the painting, and the more that the painting interacted, it was a response to what I was engaged in and what I was interacting with, but at the same time, every single part of the way that I worked was this digestion of me in my location, time, space, place, ability, capability, all of this. And when you're young, you're just trying to do something. Yeah. And you have a different kind of courageous capability, and you don't know what you're getting into. Yeah. And that, I think that's so important, because I feel like if you have a sense, it's almost like I don't know that I would have even tried to engage or felt like the confidence to engage in that way. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that as a young artist, you just have a very different kind of bombast or something.
But and you've been there for a while, and I know I should say, we're seeing some of the images go by, and we're looking at images of your work, we're looking at images of work in process, but we're also looking at other images that have influenced you or been a part of the conversation in creating the work for quite some time. And before touching on that, though, tell me a little bit about New York, say 1999, 2000. In the run-up to your first solo exhibition, in the run-up to Freestyle, and we could provide a little bit more.
Like 1999 was like, it was this time where what were the name of some of those companies, those new .com kind of booming companies, like that would deliver something to you in 2 seconds, like toothpaste or whatever you wanted, like before, like, and then they all fell out. But all of those, like money was you could grab money off the trees. It felt like that. Like it was just expansionist kind of moment. Post Bill Clinton kind of like, like a different moment in what was possible in New York. And there was a reaction against the mayor, and there was a reaction against a certain kind of an effort to contain, not dancing on tables. When there was, hip hop was like ruling on a different level, ruling the planet. And New York was just like, and the painting, and there was this kind of like bombast that was just everywhere in the city, and I feel like that was kind of the energy that we were working with, and there was this kind of momentum of early 90s, late 80s politics that had been so kind of, things had evolved to a different place, and all of a sudden you saw people having power in a different way, and there was a kind of excitement in that moment, and I think that the paintings I was thinking about and making at that time were filled with that type of like, this kind of like effervescent energy and almost like, and expansionism. Like it felt like this thing, you could almost see this sense of the universe expanding, that type of sense, that it felt that way. And, I think like 9/11 was this kind of crash of that, like this piercing of that balloon or that bubble in that moment. And I felt like that was really palatable. Like you could, that day, you knew the world was a different place. And it was, and even if only, not just the election, but which was a moment that led before that, that was a big kind of impactful moment. And this moment is really, it takes me back to that moment of Gore Bush and what happened after that election. And 9/11, when we were trying to we were evolving somewhere else, and I feel like the paintings I was doing that summer were a reaction in a sense to that election.
To that feeling.
And to that feeling, and to this kind of and I had these paintings, I was thinking about it and talking about it with a friend the other day, some of the paintings that I had there had these explosions in the buildings. That was, that stopped after 9/11, but it was there in the paintings before that moment. And it's interesting how you pick up or are connected to this other type of energy in context of what's happening. And I don't think, for me, my effort is to try and maintain that connection in terms of not just me in my studio, but me in my context, in the bigger context that I'm making and living in. And so a lot of the pictures here are part of that.
Yeah, and these had names like Renegade, names like Retropistics, names like Future.
A renegade excavation.
Renegade excavation. You were so in that.
Taking the power, shifting who can play with that, and what were what was possible, how to bend those rules, but playing with those early gestures that were taking place in art, the situationists were doing that, playing with those same type of gestures, but in Ethiopia the situationists did what they could to get lost in Paris, but in Ethiopia, you just got lost if you don't know. There's no map. There weren't any maps. It's a different reality. So I was interested in playing with those, in that space of painting, or what could be constructed in that space.
Yeah, I think I have to note that. There's got to be an underlying sense of place, an underlying sense of context that gives you that wherewithal. It's one thing to come about in that moment, to go to school, to be engaged in conversations in that way, but I also want to just provide a little context of what it was like being in New York, and we've talked a little bit about Freestyle in particular. Freestyle was an exhibition that was organized by Thelma Golden at Studio Museum in Harlem. She had just barely gotten there, if I remember correctly, and that was also a sign of a very significant change in the way that that museum would be doing things. It was an exhibition that has been cited as changing a sort of discourse, which included your work, which included a lot of artists who are in our collection. Sanford Biggers, Rashid Johnson, I could go on.
Yeah, Mark Bradford.
Mark Bradford. I mean, this was a moment that it must have provided another sense of belonging, or another sense of, I can say this.
Yeah, I think that it comes, like, all of what was happening with, like, in terms of even just music taking over and being the context for that, and the title Freestyle even coming from that language, like, went from, like, small back clubs to, like, being able to take on a center stage. But what was interesting about participating in that is that it provided room for artists who wanted to work in the who were working in a language that didn't want that. Like, intentionally, I was trying not to, within abstraction, trying not to work with something that you could define and say, this is what you're seeing, this is who you're talking about, this is who, like, that's what the intention of staying in mark making and abstraction, like, it was to not say, this is my father, or this is my mother, this is where I come from, and this is, so it was to avoid that but at the same time mining that. And so that power comes from that context and being a part of that, but also comes from, and I really think this is for our generation, our parents were like, my parents were the Africanists, like, they were like inventing what was this next moment in post, decolonized Africa. Right. And they were the ones who were inventing what was possible in that sense. My parents, my father's Ethiopian, my mother is of European descent here, comes from the States and came. So she's white American. And, they met 1969 Baltimore. I mean, they got married in Addis Ababa in 1969, but 1968 Baltimore. 1967 was like the first moment that, when was Al Loving? I mean, when was Loving? It was like 67. So. Yeah. And then they go and they're rebuilding what could be this next moment, and that's who we come from, and so that possibility, that's one of the most utopian gestures or efforts, and then coming from that place, so coming from parents who were the activists in the 60s or those agents, like, or in the 50s, that was in a fundamental part of who we were. So then coming to I grew up in Michigan, and being raised in Michigan between the DIA and the Chicago Art Institute and East Lansing, where I went to the Kresge Art Museum, where we had, like, our Morris Lewis, like, that was it. But, like, now they have this great Broad Zaha Hadid building, so kids are growing up with something else. But, like, this is where, this is what I was seeing, and coming from this other place, trying to find this, like, how do you invent yourself in that space? And I grew up with that energy of where we came from, but then being displaced, and the revolution failed, and we had to leave Ethiopia, and you had to reinvent yourself in East Lansing, Michigan. And that's, like, you know what I mean?
And that was easy.
Well, that was what it was. I mean, it was like, exactly. It was actually a place where you're negotiating realities constantly, and there isn't one. You're seeing many different points of view, and so there isn't one narrative that you can say, and that's, I think, what was fundamentally one of the main core reasons why I stayed with abstraction, or was insistent on this place where even looking at things from multitude of perspective, like, that was part of the intention with these paintings, that there's this many myriad levels of context and understanding and possibility, and I think that comes from negotiating those realities. Mm-hmm.
Just one other aspect I think about that moment that I just curious about is, the project, Christian Hayes Space, and if I'm not mistaken, the first show that you had there was with Peter Rostovsky and Elm Green and Dragset. I mean, a duo from Scandinavia, and then Peter being another Brooklyn-based painter or another New York-based painter. It was a hodgepodge of I think, different ways of working. And you've talked a little bit about, what was the underlying sort of ground for you to make the work that you made, but this is just a little more context in terms of that moment.
And Christian blew my mind at that moment because of what he was trying to invent in Harlem was this gallery that had these legendary conceptual and radical artists of color, as well as European artists, conceptual artists and performance artists who were thinking and making, in really, I thought, radical ways. And even that concept of putting that show together, to put this type of painting, or like when I remember seeing a Nodder show there, and I hadn't seen anything like that. That was like, he's a Berliner, right, or German-based artist, and there was just seeing things that you just didn't normally see in New York. And because I think Christian was able to travel so much and see so much when he was a critic, he really was able to carry certain languages that he picked up on, or gestures or impulses and sensibilities, and brought this raw group of artists together that was such an honor to be a part of, and such an important part of my history. But working with a gallerist like him, talk about bombastic.
It was different.
Yeah, things were different. It was about trying to invent a different type of space in a space where that didn't exist, but within the market, not like early 90s. Like, this was a different decade, and there were different rules, and if we were going to change how to participate and who could participate in that and what that was going to be, then it had to be within the market as well, and the art world, as well as from the outside pushing, and that kind of activist gesture. It had to be within the center as well, and that was interesting to me.
Yeah. But this was also in Harlem, a place where you were living, and
right.
So there were a lot of artists around us. It's not the way that it is today, of course, quite different, and new galleries, and that is happening. But so much, a part of that moment was about in some ways, not being.
Yeah, not being in the center. Absolutely, that's true. It was Harlem. That was it. It was the Studio Museum, and then there was the project, and then eventually a few like Triple Candy and stuff. But. Yeah. That came a little later, but when Christian, his intention was, yes, to do this, but in Harlem and with these artists who some had been showing for a very long time, Daniel Joseph Martinez or William Popel, but being able to do it in Harlem and with this motley crew of artists, and bring the art world from Chelsea and from Soho up, and from Midtown up to Harlem to experience this work, and then and he negotiated in that world on the terms of that world. And there was something really important about both of that. And eventually, one of the reasons he did move to 57th Street is because he needed to be right, and he wanted to be right there, right in the middle, yeah.
2001, you spoke about it as a little bit of a changing point. I think the work obviously changed a little bit after, as you mentioned. That idea of feeling decentered, and you mentioned a word of like multiplicity. A lot of those early paintings were characterized by almost an encyclopedic compendium of architectural moments or styles. Is that something that changed? Was it did the work become more inward, or was it
like since then? You mean?
How did 2001? How did it change?
Okay, so I think what happened is then after that there was this kind of, as you said, the encyclopedic type of dynamic that was taking so it was as if you could look back through time and collapse it all into one painting, and do that through architectural narrative, right? And then you could have, and all of this could be so that nothing happens, no narrative is happening in its own space. It has this massive context of time. It's all collapsed. Space and time is collapsed in the gesture of the painting as well. And then after that, I think I started to really then look at specific forms of architectural drawing. So the stadium is one that was the build-up for the war and the Iraq War, and the spectacle around that, and the parade, and the propaganda, and the big kind of endeavor of what that took. And then around that time, and it's just after that, the beginning of the war, we had the Olympics, and the kind of big, global kind of it's so different now because we have social media, and we don't, and so everything is, while you have more information, it's all really dispersed in a different way. And I feel like we're getting hit in many more ways, but at that time it was like spectacle, like the news stations, this is what was center stage, the Olympics and the war. And to me, that was like, it was being a citizen of the United States especially, it was completely, for me at that time, horrific, but also intense, and also something about the dazzlingness of that, while it also felt like collapse, was something that I was like super fascinated by. And so I wanted to study that history, and you know, really pay attention and try and go deep into that form of architecture and the history of that form of architecture, its use, and then and the kind of metaphor and symbolism that come from that.
Absolutely.
And then I think that's what started to take place, like in the work, more directly, the stadium, then military architectural history, and then really delving deeply into that through the war. I moved to Berlin, living in Berlin, looking at...
When did you left, what, 2000?
Yeah, 2007. Like, I was a fellow at the American Academy, and then I went back in 2008, 2009, and then came back to New York then. 2009. So we were there right, like the financial crisis, we were in Berlin when that...
Right, which I mean, leads to that sense of displacement. I mean, with the exception of having been in school, you had not lived abroad, I mean, except for that time in Senegal before that, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I had lived, that was the first time I had lived abroad again, and with a child, like, and so it was very different. And I was invited to the American Academy in 2000, it was in 2006 actually, and when I was invited for a whole year, and I was like, half a semester is enough. Like, and I think it comes from actually being raised from an East African dad, and his relationship, and that kind of being a big voice in our family. And my mother's relationship was really, I think, similar to his, in that, like, Germany was not something that was on our cultural radar as a place that you wanted to go. It was like, it was, you know, you either learned French, and France was okay, but like the UK, there were places in Europe you would go, but like Italy, fine, you know, like Germany was like still like kind of like in another category. And so I was just like Berlin, and I had shows in Berlin, but I didn't feel like there was this kind of deep connection with the city. And we went, and Jessica, my partner at the time, she had learned German and in school, and had a very different history of it because her stepmother was born in a DP camp, and her parents were Holocaust survivors and from Poland. So they had this very different history with the city of Berlin, and had traveled there, and her stepmother traveled there a lot for her work. And so I had this very standoffish kind of feel with the city. And when we went there, and the way that I could engage with the city, and how much the city resonated with me, and how much East Berlin reminded me of Addis Ababa. It was amazing, and how it recalled like my childhood kind of experiences of the city. And I remember, like, as an American during the war, and my perception and in a sense arrogance at what it meant to be the complicity of Germans, and I'm talking about the kind of cultural dynamics and the difficulty of how do you negotiate that. And here I was, an American citizen, where my country was waging this kind of horrifically illegal war in the Middle East and in Iraq. And in 2005, 2006, it was a disaster. And at that time, we didn't have, there wasn't any way to really negotiate that, and we were responsible. And so being in Berlin and really then getting into this history in a different way, I like it was almost a reorientation into myself, my understanding of myself as a global person, but also like as an American. It was like the time that I made I think in many ways work thinking back about the United States. So it's interesting because when I was in the U.S., I was really making work. Outside. Yeah, and then it was in Berlin that I started to really think back, and it wasn't until I finished in Berlin where I really. All that time I was making paintings that were dealing with that history, in a sense.
What did it, two things. What did it do to the work? I mean, you've talked a little bit
Well, I
about
think
that.
color kind of completely evaporated during that time, and I became much more interested in the gray, in gray. I did this show at the Guggenheim called Gray Area, where there was this much more gray palette that took over in the work. But at the same time, I did mural, which was like the most, that where color was supreme, and it was the arc of like, or the most kind of operatic of all those paintings. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I forget how you started thinking about mural maybe 3.5 years before it actually came into, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
Mural is, of course, this huge painting that is in the lobby of Goldman Sachs in New York that you started working on when you were in Berlin, but obviously, finished there. But before that moment, what were you looking at in Germany? Were you looking at other artists? Were you thinking of other artists in a different way? We talk a lot about the architectural components, the city component that has been a part of the work. You're also so attuned to our history.
yeah, you're like in it, and so whether it's like post-war artists or like even Hercules Seegers, like going back into that because you can access it there in Berlin and go to the drawing cabinet and really get lost in those drawings. But also just reading Christopher Isherwood and making sense of that moment of like where this city, where things went, where it really flipped. And it's interesting to even think about it now, considering what's going on right now and what we're negotiating. Just when you when you're able, and you read these artists, and read these kind of these novels or these stories, and somebody also gave me Benjamin's like little Berlin, that book of those little essays on Berlin, which is really kind of another thing that just came back to me. But gosh, I was looking at everything. Like the Gemälde galleries became one of my favorite museums because of what it had to offer. But I think I was really like paying attention to that moment, even Miro, like how do you look at this moment of what became kind of horrific fascism and maintain making art, or how do you then continue to make after the war? And so I was very interested in that moment, and then how that city tried to renegotiate itself, and culturally how it kept doing that. Like even with so my own stigma about the city, but then looking that in its face, but then it's just those scars are everywhere in Berlin. They don't disappear, and yet Berliners are so free, and there's this kind of very fresh kind of energy and openness and dynamic that can take place there. In the end, I chose not to live there. I couldn't stay there because there's not enough there's not enough Africans there. But it's like, yeah.
It's almost not cliche, but I think that we talk about a lot of the things that are underneath the surface of the work, and I have to say, sometimes the work begs that the reaction, the ooh-ah reaction, it's so beautiful, that it provides a different points of entry, if you will. Is it something that you think about? Do you think about the balance between, there's a lot of material inside of your paintings, and not everybody is going to access all of that, and some people are going to access a little bit, and some are only going to see the surface.
Yeah, I think I think about that a lot, and the paintings became more and more, let's say, congested or layered or dense, until I think the last few years, and then it's really been like a reduction or like working from a very different place. But what became really important in those paintings, and the denser they became, the more clear it became to me, were that these paintings were not, and I was never interested in being able to decipher the paintings and being able to say, there's Rome, and there's...
Totally.
They were really about this kind of this deeper time-based experience where all of this material coalesced to kind of have this like whelming type of visual experience where it shifted somehow how you interacted, like how you either felt physically or how you could see and what you would see, but where all the information coalesced together into a visual kind of experience. So it was more in terms of the way maybe when you have a memory of walking through a city or interacting with a space or a film, where it becomes this other, where all the information becomes part of one bigger experience, and that's an experience that takes time, that evolves, and changes the way you interact. And talking about Clifford Still, I was talking about that experience with his paintings, and that's they're not flat by any means, but to have the reduction of space, and that there is no real space in those paintings. There are these planes of color, and there's dynamics that happen that physically they're really complicated, but that they suggest that type of. Their intention, I think, is that physical time-based experience of what happens with you as a viewer in the paintings. So for me, that was like, right. and I think and I think what led to like just leaving the architectural language behind was because the Mark started to be able to do that without needing the density of this context or this social context, and that could come up within the mark making.
Happens big time in the gray area paintings that you mentioned. That emphasis on line, that emphasis on the sort of movement of the marks becomes so incredibly emphasized. And I mean, it just, you know, as somebody who loves Twombly, you get into the drawing, you get into this like weird sort of poetic aspect of just mark making. Yeah. And when you begin to work on mural, it's almost like a coalescing of the earlier work and maybe some of that gray period work, it seems to me.
Yeah, like it was like all of that collapses into that painting.
Yeah.
All the 10 years before that.
You did a lot to make mural happen. It wasn't like somebody said, okay, I have this huge wall for you to make this painting on. It was an application process, no?
Yes.
Tell me more.
First, Jeffrey Deitch calls because he's the person that's working with working with Goldman Sachs to help decide how they're going to do all the commissions. They were going to do many. And
this is 2007.
2004, 5, 5, I think, when he calls. I decided in 2007 to do it. 2007, I think. I submitted the application. So he sent me the plans, and my first reaction was like, if Goldman Sachs is interested in a big painting, I make big paintings, they can buy one. Like, why would I make a commission for them specifically? And Jeffrey said, well, let me just send you the plans and just think about it. So I was in Berlin for the residency, and I had the plans in the studio. And there's this huge wall that is the wall that I ended up making mural for. It faces West Street, which is the West Side Highway, and it's diagonally across the corner from the World Trade Center site and from the Freedom Tower and from that memorial. And that wall in the plans in the studio, they just kept nagging me. And I had conversations with my brother, and he was like, why wouldn't you try and do something that is different than what you do? Okay, so you don't want to do just a big painting, but what else could it be? And that wall kept calling me because it was a wall that you could actually see from the city. It wasn't a space like inside the building where you would have a painting, and you have that in many like corporate lobbies, but that this wall was not just a part of a corporate lobby, that it would be part of the fabric of the city down there. It's on the park, it's on the sidewalk, you ride your bike by it, you rollerblade by it. I used to skate down there all the time. It's on the West Side Highway, you drive by it, you walk towards the building from different directions, you see it. On the other side of it is an African-American burial ground, a Native American burial ground. It's a charged site, like in all different ways. And this wall was also the blast wall and fortification of the building. So it's also, it's not just so it has all these other kind of, so I started to think about it, and then I thought, okay, but I can't do this just by myself. I was like, I called Lawrence Troy, who is a colleague, close friend. We used to have Denison Hill together. We lived together for a little while up there. And in conversation, I said, and he was studying architecture. He's an architectural historian, and I was talking to him and telling him these ideas, and said, will you help me? Like, if I want to, this is my idea, but I need help to make this application. And with him and Beth Stryker, we came up with this proposal. And we proposed this kind of absurd idea of creating a painting that could to tell the story of world capitalism in abstraction, and had all these various layers.
In one painting.
In one painting on one wall, and it would be this organ of the building, and it would also be on this fortified wall, and it would have. And I gave this presentation similar to what you're seeing. I mean, I didn't edit the content or the information, and I didn't give them an idea of what the painting would look like. I just said this would be the various layers. We would do a lot more research, and it would try and have the history of the financial world in terms of the architecture of that, the infrastructure of that, from trade routes all the way through to the internalization of the marketplace, early bourses. And this would be somehow this encyclopedic painting that would carry all this type of information and then kind of invent something else with that. That was the idea. And it was this absurd idea I proposed it, and then they ended up being into it. But I think what became exciting for me, and the reason I was interested in doing it, was to give painting on canvas, really painting, a place in the public city, and also a place in a sense where people, 10,000, 12,000 employees of this building, 75% of them are support employees, and a big part of the people who work in that building, a big part of the community around there are not museum goers. They're not gallery goers. They don't go and interact with painting. To be able to interact with a painting every day, I was really interested in that, and the painting's made with that audience also in mind.
And in that context, obviously, I mean, it's a painting that is a work of public art, basically.
Yeah, that's my interest. Even though you still can't get in, and we got to change that. That'll happen, though.
It's an incredible piece. Question: printmaking.
Yeah.
Our piece downstairs. You've been making prints since the very beginning, going back to being in school. Tell me a little something about that relationship.
I mean, printmaking since school, that's where I really became, where I learned printmaking and started to work with it. And all along, it's actually where I started to come into my language and the marks. So it was working in painting, working in drawing, then trying to work in prints. There's something about how pared down everything has to be, that you become so precise in what you're doing, not even here, but here. And then that becomes clear here. And so printmaking, since I was forced to do it in graduate school, it was. And I became really it became something, it was a painting printmaking program, and they pushed painters. We had to do this introductory to Intaglia course and learn it. And we were all really not very happy about having to do that, but felt like it was a waste of our time, and it was so important for all of us. And through the years, I just kept working on prints. I would and it used to be make a body of painting, make a body of drawings, and then go work on prints, and then those prints would change how I would think about everything else. And the prints were really small. And then when I started working with Gemini, I was able to work on a much bigger scale. With Myriads, it was really an interesting experience, because I didn't work on one big print, which I had done with them before, but I was able to. I was working on the four Magamas, and then for Documenta, and those were looking at the revolutionary squares, and these prints were coming after that. But there was something that was happening with the verticality of being able to work, the verticality of those paintings, and being able to work in that form with the copper plates on one press, and to be able to. They invented ways that I could work on the plates at that scale very loosely, in a way that I hadn't been able to do before in the same way. And so through that process, some things changed. And I feel like they changed how I went back into the painting. Color, the looseness of airbrush, the handprints, all of these elements of unfolding a body. Like the body started to have a different place in all of the paintings that came after that. And so that's just an example of how much working back in the prints, being able to unfold things, take them apart, only color part of a plate, you can work so differently with it. And you can go back and undo things and then keep parts of things, which you can't do in painting and you can't do in drawing in the same way. Right. And so that's it provides a whole other way to experiment and invent and kind of take apart the work.
A couple more questions just before we turn it over.
Okay.
Magama paintings you mentioned, right? There's the mural. The work is often, you know, as you said, there's this cycle, and it often relates to what's happening in the world around us. So the Magama paintings is a reference to the work you did for Carol and Christoph Pekarkia for Documenta.
Yes.
That was 2012?
2000, yeah, Documenta is 2012, so 2011,
Okay.
right?
2011 into
2013, it was 2013 or 2012?
Got me.
I think so. It's
Anyway,
all meshed together now.
but
2013 was the summer of Documenta, I think.
okay.
So I was working on the paintings 2012. That's
And thinking
definitely-
about what was happening in that moment.
Yeah, and it was after what's referred to as, or the Arab Spring, what do I call it, Arab African Spring, and then the revolutions and those gestures and revolutionary squares being filled didn't stop that year. 2012, Brazil was like packed. You know, every square was packed, and what took place in Ukraine, and this stuff kept going for a long time. And what took in terms of those types of social actions, Paris, these things like New York City. Mm-hmm. So I think like my interest came out of 2011, and especially the Egyptian Revolution then, and really kind of following that, but then looking at that whole narrative around the history of what took place in those squares, that type of social gesture, and this type of event like Documenta, and this site, and being able to make these paintings that were trying to negotiate that whole gesture and desire, and the repeat action or repeat social actions in those.
And do that in Germany, and then you picked up and
Like,
stayed
yeah,
with that
so
a
when I
little
started
bit.
working on those, I was back in New York. It had just come back to New York.
Okay.
And I was working on those in Harlem.
Okay. One other, walking through Sharjah was shortly after that, and you're still dealing with some of that material.
So Sharjah, those paintings come after the Mogamas. And the Mogamas I think of as like the height of, or the, not the height because I still worked on my show for Marion Goodman after that of the new work, but it was almost the kind of like, the most kind of fervent kind of like, the architectural language was so dense, and its intention and what it was doing in the paintings and how it was working, it was becoming this other labyrinth as this, and what it was doing this in all the paintings, and then it started to break apart, right? And so the ruins of what was happening in Aleppo and Homs and Damascus, and the kind of failures of those gestures, they were breaking apart, and they became part of the paintings. They became enmeshed within the drawing, and so the paintings were about like these other forms that were kind of starting to, with the fallout of the architecture. There was this kind of fallout that was the marks and the architecture fused together into this kind of monstrous other, and these other forms started to emerge, and that interest in those other forms and this other third space, that's where the gray paintings and the Sharjah paintings and all of the more recent work came out of that. And it was almost a retreat from the failures or the disappointments and then the expected failures, but also the kind of how do you then reinvent, like with insistence on this? And then it's like going back to those post-war painters. Like, how do you, because it's essential to keep doing this, but how do we do that in the face of that failure?
Well, it seems like we talk about cartography in the early work. We talk about the mark-making aspect. You talk about restraining color in the gray works, right. And that continuing to some degree in the Documenta pieces. But it seems like, and from my experience, there's something that happens with tone later. Like those paintings from Sharjah felt really dark in a way. In a way that almost, it became more about that sort of earlier abstract expressionist work, where it was not the emphasis so much on your line, but on contour, on shape,
Yeah.
on the movement of sort of tone for the painting.
Yeah,
And I think that's something that continues, or maybe it's something that you're coming out of with the last show.
Yeah,
at
it does,
American.
for sure. And the color and the blurred images, the blurred photographs that become the underpaintings for a lot of those paintings become the light or the mood of those photographs, and the light that's caught in those photographs, that's the only information you have in the paintings that's blurred, and then that becomes part of this tone that you're talking about, and this kind of mist or experience it's just, I think of it as this context, but it becomes the space of the marks, and a lot of the gestures in the new work, these abstract marks, they carry on. They're all like quotations in ways of, and you realize that the more you make, so many marks have been made, and you can't make a mark that doesn't signify another artist, like. And so, like, you make, you brought up Twombly, or you bring up, like, it could be Michaud or Pollock, or, Hammonds, and Hammonds references other kind of early cave kind of handprints, sure. And you see so there are these, like, none of these marks are made, so then you have a mark that might look like this Guston mark that could be like, right? Yeah. So then all these elements, and so I was thinking about, like, how, like, being able to quote them all. And I was thinking then about language, like thinking how these things interact. And for me, it's like almost like this effort to make visual neologisms, like kind of, if neologisms are the invention of new words because you need to invent new language to deal with the social reality that you can't deal with the language at hand, this is what this abstraction, this is what I'm playing within this abstraction, is the effort. You can't necessarily just invent, but this form still is so potent, and there's a lot that's at hand that I'm trying to negotiate through the making of these paintings. And so that's just a way that I was trying to make sense of, like, those quotations, that they're not just these quotations, but it's the effort of putting these two things together, so that a Hammond's hand off of a Guston arm, how does that with a different gesture that I add, what does that do? Like, how does that change what that is participating in that language or something, like? Mm-hmm.
Before turning it over, as if we weren't talking about a little bit of, obviously the what's happening around us is pervasive in the work, is pervasive in right. Your presence in the studio. This week we had a call by artists, a call for help me, not a boycott, but J20.
A day of disengagement, a commitment to disengagement.
And you were...
Disruption, disobedience.
Right on. and you're a signatory on there.
Yes.
Obviously, you go in and out, but what is the moment like? I mean, you started off, you said, we talked about a little bit of our sort of pre-911 environment, and here you are.
I think the last 3 days in the news give us a sense of how kind of fraught this moment is, and how nervous and anxious. I mean, Obama in his farewell speech used the word jealous anxiety or something like that, with anxious jealousy, something and I think, like, there's that, there's that context. That's it's a very kind of nerve-wracking moment. And I can't imagine I felt nervous in 2000, and then what happened? And that was with, like, rational politics in place, like, in some way. And I just can't, I'm really concerned, but I also feel that we are, as makers, cultural thinkers, cultural makers, contributors, voices, inventors, creative thinkers, it's more crucial than ever to do what we do. But this day, the inauguration and the implementation of Donald Trump as being the president of the United States, that day, for me, the intense kind of organized community coming together, our creative community coming together and saying, this is a day that we're not going to do our work. We're going to participate in making a statement and resisting what we don't think should be part of the language of the this kind of fascistic language that's become center stage in a way. And so I think like for me, there's several ways that I'm negotiating this moment. It's I want to say yes to as much as I can, and anyone who's going to offer a way to resist or to make a statement or to maintain and insist on place, more than anything, to insist on something, then I'm there. Like, and I feel like those who took the effort and energy to make that happen, I might not agree with every step of that, but this is a moment of coming together and finding a way to invent and maintain and keep like something, this democracy, but also a lot more at stake together. And so for me, like being involved in that, like I feel more like cultural institutions and who we are and what we are as part of that, we are necessary and we should be making. And but that one day, when that call came to participate in this day of action and to get in the street and to not work and a day of non-compliance, I was like all for it. And my kids won't go to school that day either. They're going to be with us. Like we're going to, just in the sense of like taking a stand, but also because the art world, we have to also negotiate differently with how we contribute. Like my work is a part of the art, the market that is part of this elaborate art world. And there's so much in that is necessary, and there's so much of that that's also needs to be like what we're doing and trying to make. Where that's coming from, we need to be reminded of that. And I feel like this is a moment where the crucialness of like why we invent and make, and in terms of who we are as human beings and where we stand in our work, like that's so essential. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm like behind that. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I know exactly what you're saying. There's no better place to end on that note.
Say it again.
I admire you so much, and there's no better place to end than on that note. Okay. So we open it up.
I just quickly decided to ask this, so it might come out a little bit jumbled up. A lot of the architecture that's in your drawings, at least in that period that you did use building facades, it seems to be neoclassical architecture, so something that has to do or references purity and symmetry and the idea of the facade. Yet your drawings always seem to suggest the opposite. So something more about depth and I guess not disorder rather than order and symmetry. So did this architecture that you chose have to do with context? Because I imagine Ethiopia has neoclassical architecture because of the time that it was colonized. Or is it just that architecture you were drawn to it?
Well, I think like maybe that's what stands out, and there's a structure of that type of architecture that becomes like an underlying structure in the kind of general structures of the painting. There's a lot of other forms of architectural like language in the paintings as well. Ethiopia was never colonized. It was the one country on the continent that wasn't colonized and that was occupied during the Second World War by Mussolini. But outside of that, it wasn't colonized. And actually, a lot of what is interesting in Ethiopian architecture is kind of what was built in the moment of like late modernism, or when you had in the 1970s, late 60s, and that moment you had a lot of really interesting kind of building in Ethiopia, and that came from more of the kind of Soviet utopian kind of like that. It came, I mean, sorry, just before like the Soviet utopian kind of concrete block housing structures that started to kind of come in and into Ethiopia, but the kind of early modernist, mid-modernist kind of late modernist moment of this kind of other types of circular banks and this idea of like I don't like to think of it as a European modernism because it really emerged from within Addis Ababa, and I think it was really a simultaneous type of moment, and it was really Emperor, Haile Selassie, who was involved in these efforts and choosing these architects to kind of develop a new type of Addis Ababa. That's the information that reminded me so much of certain buildings you see in East Berlin. But in general, like I think like neoclassical buildings and that form informed so much of what took place and what happened in modernism. And I think that's where you see that line, because there's a lot of that type of language in the work. But that's not just in that work, it's also what you see in the built environment everywhere around you. Like I was looking at that in Miami today when we were driving around, like how many buildings are still like mimic that moment or remnants of that moment. And I think more my interest was in that built environment across many places. No, it's okay. I mean, no, it's all right. I mean, you can ask on the side. It's just... that I would be as engaged in the world as you can be, and as like curious as possible. Look at everything, read everything, see everything, listen to everything, taste everything, and follow like who you are, and really try to invent from within that space. But I think that like being able to reach out outside of like the specific reality and social construct of the kind of world that is very close to you, I would just say that I think pushing those boundaries is really important, and being able to really try and find other places like and information to kind of participate in who you are. And it's kind of like what Obama said the other night about trying to have a conversation with a real person, like outside of the web. I mean, like, go and look at everything, but like, and talk to those who, the work you can't understand is the work you should try to understand the most. The work you react against is the work to try and make the most sense of, like in a way, and really, like to constantly be that student of what's being made and what's being made culturally on all levels.
Thank you so much. Can you speak just briefly about the collaborative effort of printmaking and perhaps how it's different for you from working with other media?
I think that working with master printers, they have the ones that I've worked with, each one has this amazing knowledge of what they're doing and what they can what they can contribute to the work, and they come with these ideas of what else you can do that I haven't thought about, and then they have the technology to make that happen. So it's not like, I do this in my painting, how do I do this in printmaking? They come and say, this is how you can try to do these things you do in painting, but you could also try da-da-da-da-da. And so they provide all these alternate ways of even thinking about what I already do. And then they're able to also provide an eye at looking at what I've done and talking to you about it. Like, so I'll make something, and it's not just, I didn't want it to turn out like this is how I want. Especially when I was just learning, I would have basically daily crits with the master printer I was working with. Greg Burnett would sit there and be like, well, so I think this is really working. This isn't. And so it would be this project would evolve in conversation and really in collaboration with the master printer. I think it changes a little more as you know and you become more fluent in the language of printmaking, because then you get excited about certain things and you want to push the boundaries of that capability or that technology. And they're usually just as excited to go there and invent ways to make that happen.
I just would add, which there obviously is a real comfortability with Gemini, because obviously the work we have downstairs is not the first time you've worked with them.
Yeah.
And you've pressed the conversation in such a way that has led to different devices being used in order to create the work in the first place.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really, and because Case is, and you know, it's interesting, he's the closest to my age of all the printmakers that I've worked with, so it's a very different. And then Niels in Copenhagen is terrific also, and he invented all different kinds of ways of being able to work with photogravure, and so it's really, it's terrific.
Hello? I wonder about the, in your approach, there's this tension almost between these marks that are very gestural and they seem very spontaneous, and then you have a very structured underlaying almost skeleton. And I wonder if you can speak about how you approach the two things together in terms of planning, and then there's an execution in which there is a lot of free form.
So I think the architectural drawing, that skeletal framework that you're referencing comes, like, it usually each painting has a lot of architectural drawings in it. So it'll be, let's say, I don't know, 200, 300 photographs that are projected into the painting, traced, parts of those photographs are traced, and then another photograph is projected. I don't really have a sense of what that painting is going to look like, even of the architectural drawing when I start the painting. It's more of what at the time, what the architectural information would be. And then I would sort through the photographs and then pick a photograph and project it in the drawing. What happens on the painting, then I would look for another photograph to respond to that drawing, and it would then evolve, and the painting would, in this context or infrastructure in the painting would grow. And then, so in that way, I'm also then, when the architectural drawing got to a place of being, let's say, saturated or enough, or a system enough, or a context enough, where I felt like it was finished, I would start to then draw into that with the characters and the marks and my drawing and the gestures, and that they really react and respond and participate and break down and digest that architectural drawing. So since it's built so slowly, I'm so engaged and immersed in it and what that image is, and the way that I respond to it is from within that place. And it's a different process, but at the same time, they're both intuitively made and approached. There's not a final image. In fact, if a painting starts to look like something that I expect, I usually then do stuff with the marks or erasure that actually undermine that, because then it's not interesting, it's not potent, it doesn't have the kind of power or kind of it doesn't stop me in a way where I'm learning something else from making the painting. There's not a step in it.
Julie, I'm interested in the role of photography in your work, and curious, a lot of these pictures, are these pictures that you've taken, and including the ones that were in Iraq and Egypt and Syria?
Oh no, I haven't taken. I haven't taken very little.
What's the role of?
These are mostly media photographs that we all have access to. They're news photographs from. They used to all be clippings from the front page of the New York Times, and then I started to get most of the images from the web and from news media on the web, and then eventually started to research specific context for images around that specific context that were going in, that were being participating in the making of the paintings. But these are generally current event archive images that I keep in the studio. I used to keep them up on the walls all around me in the studio. Now I usually just have them. They were information that led into the paintings and were used in the paintings, and now I just have them as information of the moment. But they're layered in the photographs of the exhibition. Some of them have been, and I should say now, some of them are actually photographs that are used in the work, but they're blurred before they're used in the work. So they've either informed the work as a context, or I use them in the work as a source in the work. Yeah.
Glad you didn't have to go to Iraq to take these pictures.
Please join me in thanking Julie.
Thank you.